All right, I'm going live a little bit early because we have a lot of questions, and there's no sense me just sitting around for 5 minutes doing nothing while the questions are pouring in. And actually, to answer the very first one, I went and got myself a few props out of the library. So, first question, gutter grown, what resources did you use to teach yourself Latin? So, let me say from the beginning, people often ask me about, Latin, Greek, German, things along those lines. And I would not suggest trying to learn languages the way that I did, in part because I did things in very strange ways that worked out for me, but probably wouldn't work out necessarily for everybody else. And I'm also, when it comes to understanding languages, kind of a systems person. I don't like doing a lot of memorization for memorization's sake. I like to understand how languages function as a system. So I'll start by saying this. I first started learning Latin in a very low level when I was in 6th and 7th grade. And that's because I went to University Lake School, which was a private school that I got a scholarship to. And my parents wanted me there because, the public elementary and middle and high schools were not very good where I was growing up. We grew up out in the countryside, and they just didn't have a lot of resources. And so I went there, and I learned a lot of stuff at ULS. There's a lot of stories I could tell about that. Maybe I'll do that Sadler stories, because most of the kids there were very rich, and very few of them were particularly smart. So I got to see how class dynamics worked close up. But I did get to study Latin. And so, I learned basic stuff. Like in the first year, I think even by like the second year, we'd only learned 2 declensions, and we didn't really learn much of the conjugations or anything like that. I think we may have been introduced to the 3rd declension by then, but most of the kids were really struggling with the class, and I was kind of screwing off in the class. So drop that, and then fast forward how long would it be? So when I left 8th grade, I would have been 13, and then I started studying Latin when I was in graduate school, and I started my first year there. So that would be, I was 25. Yeah. So 12 years in between. And I had an Army field manual that was for JAG officers. And I started using that. It was like a teach yourself Latin thing for people to learn enough Latin to be able to read texts that they needed to do for the Army. And so I worked my way through that. And then I was like, well, that's cool. I think I have a good sense of Latin. Now I knew that because I'd already, learned French and German, that one of the things you do is you go on to you leave behind the study of the language as such, and you read texts, you read authors, and try to gain some vocabulary that way and get to see the language, you could say, in the wild, So I went and I got from the library at Southern Illinois University a copy of this book, Cicero's Academia. And this is a low version where it's got the Latin on one side and the English on the other. And I thought, well, I should be able to read Cicero now. No, it took me an entire semester to get through reading 10 pages of the Academia, and I was like, wow, this is difficult stuff. So then I thought about, okay, well, what are the people actually learning Latin doing? And they had like the wheel lock stuff there as textbooks, and I was like, well, I don't need that crap. I've already like learned a lot. What I really need is the reference book that they have, Allen and Greeno's New Latin Grammar. And it's probably not new anymore, right? This is an amazing book. It's got like all these amazing discussions broken down into sections about all the different stuff that's going on in the language. And it also connects it with Indo-European linguistics. So there's comparative stuff between that and what's going on in Proto-German and what's going on in Greek and Sanskrit and all of that. So I found this fascinating. And I took a year. And, a couple hours a day, I worked through sections of this grammar book and looked at every single example that they provided. And then I was like, okay, now I'm going to come back to reading texts. So one of the first texts, Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, in this, Latin, English, Latin on one side, English on the other version, which is very nice to have. Sometimes the English translations aren't very good, especially the ones by Anthony Kennedy, believe it or not, because he sort of like turns Aquinas into an analytic philosopher, but often they're interesting. And Aquinas wrote deliberately in a simple Latin because believe it or not, the Summa Theologia is supposed to be a book for beginners. It's not meant to be like advanced studies. And so, I worked through that, and then I was like, well, I need something a bit more challenging. And that's how I got into Anselm, reading Anselm's Proslogion in Latin. I was like, holy crap, there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. And I kind of like the way that he uses the language itself. And then after that, it was just, doing one thing or another. I got involved with the Aquinas Translation Project, translating the commentary on the Psalms, the last book that he was working on at the time that he died, along with the Summa Theologia, Tertium Pars, Tertia Pars, right? And then, started reading other authors as well, and that's basically it. So I don't know that path would be all that useful. It's rather idiosyncratic, isn't it? I don't know that would be that helpful for others. And I don't know about other resources to teach yourself Latin, because I don't need to use any other resources, because I'm not at that point. So it's not something that I specialize in, helping other people learn languages. That would be a great thing for somebody who's like a contemporary Latin teacher. All right, next question from Mark. Glad to see you here, Mark. How am I doing? How are all the classes going? Am I excited for Stoicon X? So I'll do the first two. I'm doing okay. I'm teaching 6 different classes this semester, some of which involve producing new video content. So I have shot probably over 100 new videos for my different classes already at this point in the semester. It'll probably be around 300 by the time that I'm done. I've got a medical ethics class, a business ethics class, a straight out normal ethics class, intro to philosophy, existentialist philosophy and literature, and world religions. And so world religions and biomedical ethics, I'm shooting a lot of video content for those classes, shooting more existentialist stuff for existentialism. Not too much new stuff for business ethics or intro to philosophy. There I'm kind of relying on the catalog that I've built up already. But I did shoot some new business ethics content about virtue ethics. And so, I'm like super busy. We've also had some illnesses here. And so that, makes things tough a little bit. Wednesday last week, I was not this last week, the week before that, I was like so out of it. I had to cancel all my client meetings and classes because I think I'm not even sure what I was saying to people. I was probably kind of delirious. But things are good. It's fall here now, beautiful time of year. Got to see my daughter yesterday, who took the bus down from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee down here she went past the downtown. She was in the neighborhood south of us. So I took a walk out there and got to chit chat with her a bit and meet some of her, people in her program who came along with her. And that's always nice. So, I'd say things are pretty good, and we are heading into this Stoic season. There's the big Stoicon coming up, which I'm an on-deck speaker for, and doing a lot of behind-the-scenes things. There's Stoic Week, and then there's all the Stoicon X's coming up, including one that we are doing. I'm speaking in 2 others, the Stoicon X New England next week, and Stoic Salon, which is sometime in November, I believe. So a lot of stuff going on, All right, Matthew has a Stoic-related question. Myself and a friend have been using your videos on the Stoics to back up our self-directed study. We're interested to know your thoughts on how Stoicism intersects with Christian thought. So that's a complicated topic. There is no really simple way to express that. A lot of people think that Stoicism and other philosophies like Epicureanism just kind of went away because Christianity came on the scene and came to dominate thought. And that is totally not the case. Once you start actually looking into the history of thought, for a variety of reasons. So I'll just lay out a few of these, but you could probably write a whole book tracing out these things. And as a matter of fact, some books have been written, what is it? I'm blanking on her first name, Kolisch. I want to say Martha, but I don't know that that's right. She has a great book on Stoicism in the Middle Ages because the monks were reading Stoic literature and transmitting it. But here's what we can say. So the first thing to keep in mind is that Christianity emerges within a Greco-Roman culture that has already been in formation for a very long time, is not a monolithic thing. By the way, the people who are like, I love ancient Greece, I love ancient Rome, usually they don't know what the hell they're talking about. If they showed up, they would have been ostracized or kicked out or enslaved right away. We're talking about like the real Greco-Roman culture, which was a mishmash of lots of different things going on, and it wasn't just about big five philosophies or anything like that. Schools of rhetoric were competing, medical schools were competing. There's lots of different things happening culturally. And you can say that Stoicism as a school was a big and important school. But one of the key things that you see in Hellenistic and then later ancient philosophy is eclecticism, the willingness, and syncretism, the willingness to take ideas from other people and adapt them. This is big in Middle Stoicism, where Posidonius and Panaetius are actually incorporating things from the Platonic or Aristotelian points of view. This is big even with Chrysippus, who is reacting to the academic skeptics and the Epicureans and what's left of the Aristotelians at the time. And you can say a similar thing with Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, which was a major movement in philosophy, used Aristotelianism or Stoicism or a combination of both sort of as a basis for a lot of what they're doing, and then they would have Platonic conceptions sort of on top of that. Great example, Simplicius, his commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion, which is a really cool work, is framing Epictetus and Stoicism within a Neoplatonic perspective. So Neoplatonism winds up being one of the main, you could say, vectors of early Christian thought, right? There are pagan Neoplatonists like Plotinus and Proclus. There are Jewish Neoplatonists. Arguably, Philo of Alexandria would fit into that. There are Christian Neoplatonists who are many of the church fathers, right? So they know Stoicism. You'll find Clement of Alexandria using some Stoic thought, incorporating it into his ideas, sometimes pushing off against it. Lactantius, in discussing the anger of God, will actually talk about all the different ancient philosophical schools and then why Christianity sort of adds something better to the mix. And so Stoic thought, along with other thought, was incorporated into early Christian thought. And we can also talk about practices as well. Monasticism, which really had its sort of hardcore interpretations in Palestine and even more in Egypt, drew upon Neoplatonic thought and drew upon Stoic thought. So, there's a great argument for how the 8 thoughts of Evagrius Ponticus are really similar to what's going on in Stoicism. This is a case made by Margaret Graver. Of course, you know that from the 8 thoughts, we get 8 capital vices in John Cassian, major monastic writer of the West, very important among Benedictines. These become, under Gregory the Great, the guy I'm named after, in his Moralia on Job, the 7 deadly sins. So there's all these interesting vectors. And as I was mentioning, the monks are preserving Cicero and Seneca and a little bit of Epictetus and, writing this stuff out and thinking about it. Also, another key thing would be Boethius, who knew a lot about Stoicism, and they read his works. Augustine talks about the Stoics at various points. So Stoicism never completely disappeared, but it was no longer like an independent school. And so there are all these different important influences well into the Middle Ages, then with the revival of Stoicism as something that you could study in the Renaissance, and in the early modern period, Stoicism was a school that was, there were some people who tried to fuse that and Christianity together in Neo-Stoicism. There were many others who looked at Stoicism as a viable school. Stoicism is a big influence on arguably Christian philosophers like René Descartes. There's important aspects of Stoicism. I mean, he and Princess Elizabeth actually in their correspondence discuss Seneca. So there's quite a bit of Stoic stuff there. If you're considering Stoicism as a system of thought and Christianity, despite the overlaps, there are going to be some places where you got to I'm going to go this way or I'm going to go this way. So you can't say they're exactly the same thing, but there's a lot of interesting overlaps and compatibilities. So, all right, let's take the next one. Dale says, how can I have confidence in my views considering the vast amount of work published on both sides of almost every idea, especially if I'm not a philosopher? Well, it gets even worse. It's not on both sides, because both sides is usually a simplistic way of representing it. Usually there's multiple sides when you start digging into it. How can you have confidence in your views? You just, keep working at it and try to arrive at the best views that you can. Sometimes you're going to have experiences where you're like, wow, man, I was so off about that back then, and now I've got better viewpoints on this or that. You don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to know every single thing. Nobody does. I mean, people have said that Hegel was the last person who could have a systematic view of all of the sciences and humanities of his time. I don't think he even had it, quite frankly. You don't have to, there isn't this absolute need to have read everybody in order to be on point about some things, because some of this we look for confirmation within our life. And you don't have to read stuff that you don't find particularly interesting or helpful. There's no duty to be a philosopher, I would say. And even the people who are doing academic philosophy, most of them are so hyper specialized that they don't know very much outside of their little field. So I wouldn't feel too bad about that. Johan, can you explain some difference and similarities between Blondel's and Derrida's projects and readings of philosophical figures? Yeah, so let's start with Derrida first. Derrida, his early work is it's not systematic as such, but it's very rigorous. And what deconstruction basically comes down to in its early stuff is saying, we're going to totally look at what this person has to say, going to read everything that the person has written, and then look for where the contradictions arise, either contradictions between texts, which is what a traditional historian of philosophy does anyway, right? You look for well, Descartes says this over here, he says this over here, can we reconcile these? But you also look for where, for example, Plato talking about why speech is better than writing in the Phaedrus. Wait a second, Plato, you're doing writing, right? Deconstruction focuses in on those sorts of things. And it also is anti-totalizing, meaning that we can't arrive at a perspective that is the single perspective that encompasses everything. And those sort of things actually should be rather non-controversial for anybody who's a serious thinker about philosophy or pays attention to what's going on in philosophical texts. But there's a lot of people who resist those sort of insights. In his middle period, Derrida, became a star, and he was still doing occasionally good, rigorous work, but a lot of the stuff that he writes, I think, is actually not worth reading or spending time on, quite frankly. And the only people who are going to be reading, say, Gla, 100 years from now are Derrida scholars, and there'll be a tiny little segment of weirdos over there in the corner. But I think On Grammatology will still be read 100 years from now. And then the later period, so the middle period, Derrida's method is, let's see what I can get away with in terms of puns and playing around with language. And then he becomes serious again, in his final period, where you find like the gift of death or the politics of friendship, where he's becoming like seriously aware that there's some crises and issues looming, like the immigrant crisis. Derrida was one of the first people to be really devoting a lot of serious attention to that from a philosophical perspective in Politics of Friendship or Spectres of Marx. And those, he's doing his usual shtick. I don't really like his bombastic claims about how deconstruction is democracy, is this, is that. I think he should have stuck with it as just being kind of a method and been a bit more humble, but I'm not Derrida. So, now Blondel, but, starting not quite 100 years before Derrida, about 90, I guess you could say, 1893. No, a little bit further than that, right? Maybe 70. Blondel is a Catholic thinker who is struggling to take, sort of a cognizance of the history of thought and approaching things, as he calls it, dialectically. It's not the same thing as the Hegelian dialectic or the Marxist or the Kierkegaardian or whatever. And he's the same sort of person where he'll read everything that somebody wrote, because you, of course, obviously want to understand the person. And then you start, you sort of like, he calls it the method of charity. You extend a complete, like, well, this stuff could be true to them. And then you see what happens when you do that. And when you do that, you find that a lot of philosophies almost like turn themselves inside out. So he's doing something similar to deconstruction, but with a different aim in mind, an aim of providing a philosophy that would be totally adequate to the requirements of philosophy, which is an ongoing process, and totally, fulfilling the exigencies, as he called them, of Christianity. Derrida doesn't have any sort of overtly theological project like that, and is actually very suspicious of that until his later works. And so those are some important distinctions, I'd say. All right. Adwin asks, I was wondering if you would watch a philosophy program made for BBC. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, most philosophy programs are usually crap because they have to they're made to appeal to the masses, and for some reason they think that the masses are stupid and are more interested in hearing bombastic, hyperbolic takes about philosophers than careful discussion about them. I suppose because it's less dramatic, So I don't know that they would be any good. The other problem with the BBC tends to be that they only, like so many other places, they only seek out the big name, famous hosts. They're not going to look for so let's say they're doing something on Thomas Hobbes. They're going to go find some Oxford-y person who may be a good scholar on Hobbes, or may just happen to be somebody who knows the producer and went to school with them and all that. And it's the same thing for American productions as well. But, they could get over that. They could produce a good show. I don't know. It would depend on the show, I'm not quite sure why there's a question about that. All right, Kierkegaardian dude, what do you think about social conservative Americans concerned about religious liberty who think that the nomination of conservative judges, justices like Amy Coney Barrett is a silver lining in an otherwise disastrous presidency? I'd say that they're 20 years behind in their thinking, and that they should have realized that the Republicans have suckered in social conservative Americans and used them for years and years and years, and they're never going to give you any of the stuff that you actually want. They're just a bunch of people interested in holding on to power. They'll say anything whatsoever, or they're complete ideologues. And when it comes to Amy Coney Barrett, she belongs to a cult. I don't know why people don't get this. If you are an actual conservative, you do not want a cultist in charge of anything because you want to conserve things. You want to keep things in play. The people of praise, I know the Reamers, Adrian, he's the one who was quoted in the New York Times article, and Marie. I've had conversations with them about this very group. They are not mainstream, the group that Barrett belongs to, not mainstream Catholics. It is not anti-Catholic to say that they're a cult. So if that's the devil's bargain that you want to make in order to get something in the Supreme Court, I think that's foolish. And foolish from a philosophical perspective, it's the opposite of wisdom. For a very long time, the Republicans, I've seen this myself because, I've been observing these things sort of within and without. I used to go to all these Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Cultures conferences where a lot of these important discussions were happening. This whole stuff about we're going to nominate these justices, terrible argument. You look at the damage that party has been doing. I'm not, by the way, letting the Democrats off the hook, but the Republicans at this point in time are definitely the worst party and have done way more damage to this society than anyone else. So if you're a conservative, I would say you can't actually vote Republican. You need to find a third party or stay home or do something else, or vote for the Democrats just to get the Republicans out and tell them that they need to reform their stuff. So I'm very unsympathetic to that notion that somehow she would be a silver lining in an otherwise disastrous presidency, and in part because of the people of praise thing too. So, all right, it just jumped a little bit. Looks like we have a lot of questions. Jesse asks, in a Hegel core concept video, I described Begierde, desire or hunger, where you act upon it, removing its independence. You probably mean the independence of the object, right? Is this just present in Hegel's idea of Begierde or partly in the German word itself? It's not necessarily in the German word itself. Hegel is defining what desire does, what desire is. And he's interested in the independence thing. So it's not inherent in the very word. It's just how it is. All right. Darko Polo says, which of the pre-industrial philosophers do I think would be the most shocked about the state of the world today in terms of population, civilization, environment, nature? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you would say which would be most shocked. We'd have to know something about their psychology in order to say that, and I don't know that we can actually predict that sort of stuff. And you're asking about a lot of different things: population, civilization, environment, nature. Might be that some of them would be more shocked about the population, some would be more shocked about civilization or lack thereof, some would be shocked about the environment, some would be shocked about technology. I don't know how we could say who would be most. Chris Meyer, the so-called Neoplatonists. I don't know why you'd say so-called, because that's what we call them. Worth spending time on? Yeah, of course they are. So everybody's worth spending time on. So are the Stoics. So are the skeptics. So are Galen, somebody who's not really a philosopher as such, but a medical writer. Lots of philosophy in his stuff. So yeah, Plotinus is the big heavy hitter, right? As I mentioned, a lot of the church fathers are themselves essentially coming from a Neoplatonist perspective, a Christian Neoplatonist perspective. Arguably, Augustine and Boethius are as well, right? And then there's all these other, people like Proclus, and there's also these interesting people that are middle/Neoplatonists, like if I remember, Ammonius. But you can find a good history of philosophy that'll clue you into them. The big guy, of course, is Plotinus, but there's a lot of other really great Neoplatonist authors. I mentioned Simplicius as one, who are definitely worth reading. Anupam says, I learned that Sarah Ahmed is querying the Husserlian subsumption of embodied historicality by a disembodied phenomenology. What does it mean in simple language? I don't know. I don't read her. So I don't read everybody who's out there and cutting edge. That would be a good question for somebody who has some sort of connection to her. Oh, here's a good one from Andrew. What did Rilke mean when he said love is two solitudes coming together? So he didn't really just say that. Two solitudes coming together and protecting each other is a key part of it as well, and recognizing each other. So Rilke thinks that within all of us, there is this dimension of interiority, which is not pure interiority, because it is also connected with the world that we're in, and its things and its people and animals and nature, and also what he calls the big things like death. And we all have this capacity to develop this dimension within ourselves. So he speaks of building your solitude or expanding your solitude. This is, for example, in Letters to a Young Poet, when he's talking to the young military officer who wants to be an artist of some sort, a creative type. So in, I think it's in letter 7 or letter 8, he's talking about love, and he says that most young people haven't sufficiently developed that dimension within themselves, and they try to give themselves to the other, and it's just a hot mess. It's screwed up because they haven't adequately developed themselves as beings. And this is his ideal for what love would be: two solitudes, two people who have developed that dimension within themselves and are not expecting to like have a fusion where I'm one with the other or any other sort of romantic nonsense. But rather are able to recognize each other, and there's a certain respect there, but also a certain desire and a companionship. And I think he's completely right about that. It's not realized by many people, in part because we pitch, again, as Rilke points out, we pitch so many stupid conventional ideas about what love is, and people buy into those to their detriment, and instead of like developing as fully close to their potential being actualized human beings, they offer each other kind of caricatures. So love is two solitudes, bordering and protecting each other, and you could say interpenetrating to some degree, but not where one loses oneself in the other. All right. Elijah says, do you agree with Heidegger that although he regards Hegel's system as the most powerful thought of modern times and completion of metaphysics, which he doesn't, he thinks God and spirit must be thought pre-subjective? He views Hegel's, making important contributions, bringing history into the picture. Nietzsche is the last metaphysician, according to Heidegger. So Hegel's not the last metaphysician, and he is putting forth a new view on being and beings, but it's an ultimately mistaken one as well, just like Plato was, and just like the medieval Christian thinkers were. So, yeah. Rima, what do you think about Gadamer? Gadamer is an interesting guy. For those who don't know, Hans-Georg Gadamer, student of Heidegger, one of the people big in hermeneutics, well worth reading. He's actually got some interesting pieces on Hegel and on Plato. He and Paul Ricoeur in the French sphere, were working on kind of similar stuff, using some of the same figures, I would say. Not too many people talk about Gadamer these days, which is kind of a shame. I like him. But by the time that I was in graduate school, he was kind of considered to be like, not cutting edge anymore, which is really a shame. The philosophy is way too given to like fads and cutting edge and stuff like that. All right. Tyson, what are your thoughts on PhDs in education? Well, education is my passion. I've not seen the rigor and seriousness in this field that I see in philosophy and linguistics. So I can't generalize across the board because obviously I haven't looked at every single, PhD in education or educational leadership is often what you get your degree in. But I would agree with your assessment that it's often not very rigorous. These are degrees that were created to make money for colleges and to give administrators an extra set of initials so that they could have social prestige and justify higher paychecks. I'll tell you this, every master's and doctoral program in education that I've come across, I've not been impressed with. But I haven't seen that many, I kind of think that, but then again, you can say, like linguistics and philosophy, there's a lot of dud PhD programs out there in philosophy as well. I don't know about linguistics because I haven't ever looked into that, but there's plenty of places where I wouldn't send a student. But yeah, I mean, they're kind of a made up degree. I would say a lot of the stuff that is worthwhile in it is probably going to be taught in other areas as well. But again, I got to be a little careful. I don't really know that well. that area. Zeno, would it matter if God exists or not? Depends on how you think of God. I mean, like the Epicureans who thought that the gods existed, but were blessed because they had no involvement in human life, you could probably do without those gods, right? Pascal accused Descartes of using God early in his philosophy to get everything started and then not having any use for him later on. Probably accurate, you know? So it really depends on what conception of God you have. I mean, if you have an exception of they call it a deus otiosus, a God who doesn't do anything, I'm not sure why you need that. If you have a conception of a God who actually cares about human beings and somehow intervenes in things, that probably would make a difference, right? So, yeah. Goodnam, how to get out of absolute uninterestedness. I don't think such a thing exists, but you might say that what you're talking about there in a hyperbolic way is like being generally uninterested in things. I don't know that there's a way to do that other than like finding something that you're interested in. It probably requires you to not, immediately dismiss things and to give them a little bit of, leeway, you could say, and to extend yourself into them. But I don't know. Other than just like finding something that trips your trigger, as we used to say, that may be, what you have to do. All right, Ben, just started your half-hour Hegel series, really enjoying it. Section 4 of the preface, Hegel talks about the substantial life. Is this similar to Sartre's idea of bad faith? No, I wouldn't say so. Bad faith involves a deception of oneself about whether one is deceiving. It's sort of an unstable thing. Substantial life. I mean, Sartre could say that that's bad faith, but I don't think Hegel would agree with him on that. Bruno, why do I consider Kierkegaard to be a great philosopher? What's great about his concept of anxiety? His concept of anxiety, you can see it there in Heidegger and Sartre and so many other people, right? So that's good. I mean, I think that Kierkegaard is doing some really cool stuff in his philosophy. And he's got a great critique of his contemporary culture, some of which applies to our own contemporary culture. You find that in things like, say, the present age. He also has a lot of really interesting, portions of his works where maybe you don't buy into the whole thing, but you're like, wow, this is a great insight right here. And I would say that, among Christian thinkers, he is one who's really thinking out what the conditions would be for the eternal to make its appearance in time and in humanity, within a culture that already is thinking in terms of universals and stuff like that. The other thing I really like about his work is that he, when you read through him, he really does have a lot of grasp on different ways of being a human being, So that's probably enough about Kierkegaard. I probably should do more writing about him because I do enjoy that, and I've got a few conference papers that I've never turned into articles. James, should all journal articles be open access? Will this help philosophers connect to the public? It will not help philosophers connect to the public at all because most philosophers are shitty writers and quite frankly, not particularly good thinkers. So making things open access isn't automatically going to do that. Maybe over time it would do that, but academics, if they want to reach the general public, academics need to learn how to write in ways that can actually meet the general public. Doesn't mean you have to dumb everything down or put it into listicles or life hacks or that sort of nonsense. But you do have to be able to like reach a general audience rather than just the, 4 peers of yours who are going to read the article. Should journals be open access? I don't think that they all necessarily have to be open access, but they sure shouldn't all be owned by massive companies that make tons and tons of money and don't pay the writers anything and that set up big roadblocks to other people getting access to the stuff. I think that's bad, right? So companies like Elsevier, I think, are predatory companies. It's unfortunate that we've done so much, sort of deregulation, that we've allowed companies to monopolize these things. But I don't know how we get away from this. I mean, anybody who wants to start a journal can start a journal. Maybe part of the problem is this whole notion of prestige. Like in philosophy, different journals are ranked at different levels. All those rankings are bullshit. They don't reflect the quality of the articles. What they reflect is a parochial little group of people over here who think that they're the hot shit, defining what counts as hot shit, and it's different hot shit than the people over here. There's really great articles in obscure journals. I mean, I know this from having done my research and finding those articles and being like, wow, this is amazing stuff. Why is it published here? Well, because that's where the person could get it published. Just because you have an article in mind doesn't mean that it's an actual good article, or pick whatever other thing you like. So, yeah. Let's see here. Did I miss one? Yeah, I missed one in here. Have I read Max Scheler and Emmanuel Levinas? Do I see any similarities with their work? Both are different phenomenologists having different backgrounds. Yeah, I've actually, I mean, I translated one of Scheler's works, never published the translation, Erkenntnis and Arbeit. One of my classmates ended up publishing it later on, and he used some of my manuscript to help him out. So yeah, I've known Scheler for a very long time, and I've been teaching him for a very long time as well. Levinas, of course, I knew, because Levinas was really big stuff when I was in grad school, and there were Levinasians who were constantly droning on and on and on about the face of the other and how we can never do justice to the other and blah, 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 blah. And my mentor was actually one of the early translators of Levinas. So he brought up Levinas in class all the time in a different way. So yeah, I'm conversant with those two. And they're doing different things. There's some overlap. They're both very interested in ethics in ways that Husserl and Heidegger were not. Scheler, we should remember, when we talk about early phenomenology, a lot of people want to say, oh, it was Husserl and then Heidegger and then Levinas with Merleau-Ponty in there. That's one genealogy. Max Scheler was as important as Husserl, as was Heidegger. And there were other people who were equally important as well. It wasn't just this one single thing. A little bit of a rant of mine, because phenomenologists here in the States love to ignore, Marcel and Scheler and people like that. But yeah, they're both worth reading, both worth looking into. I prefer Scheler to Levinas, but that's just me. So, Chris asks, I'd like to hear more about class dynamics in school. Well, I mean, if we're talking about University Lake School, where I went from middle school, it was a place out in Heartland, Wisconsin. It was about a 15-minute drive from where we lived, out on the border of Wales and Delafield. And it was, this is the 1980s. It was a school that at that time went from 6th grade to high school. Classes were quite small. We had like 20 kids in my class. Kind of sucked too, because the gender distribution was way off in my class. We had 5 girls and 15 guys. And it had its own beautiful campus. It promoted we're all about academics. I got to say the academics was kind of hit and miss. Some of the teachers clearly should not have been teachers. Some of them were abusive. Some of them were just burnt out. We actually had when it came to other things like athletics, so soccer was really, really big at ULS, which is cool because I liked playing soccer. We had a former Olympian as the coach. That's the kind of juice this place had. And, the Richies sent their kids there, the people that we later on would call the lake set, the people who had houses on the lakes, and that was like one of their houses. Then they'd have a summer house somewhere else or things like that. And, you got a very clear sense of where you belonged, and it wasn't with the rest of the kids if you were there on scholarship. And you couldn't participate effectively in the social life that they engaged in because, it involved things like, so I brought this up before, here in Wisconsin, skiing was a class distinguisher. If you had money, if you were upper middle class or upper class, you went downhill skiing. Except if you were like a kid who lived near the downhill ski places, then you could go as well. And the reason why you had to have money is because it usually involved a trip and then a lift ticket, which you would put onto your jacket. And so like you'd have all these lift tickets to show that you participated in this thing. Skis were expensive, and it also involved conspicuous consumption in other ways, like hanging out at the lodge, right? Whereas cross-country skiing, that was the common person's thing. So cross-country skiing you could do anywhere because we had enough snow back then before global warming. And you could just go to a local park, and maybe you'd have to pay $5 for like a season pass. There weren't any tickets involved. You could rent skis really cheap. You could buy a whole set of skis and boots and poles for $100, even less used. So, those sorts of distinctions, what you wore, I wore sort of like cheap stuff that we got at Farm and Fleet or Target or wherever. They were all wearing designer clothes, and so you learn about these distinctions very early on, and it's kind of driven home to you. It was also, I'll mention, it was a pretty racist place, pretty sexist place. There were a lot of things wrong with it as a school. I'm told it's different now, but I don't really know. So that's probably enough about that. Kyle says, Thomas Hobbes lists 3 inalienable rights: self-defense, the right to resist imprisonment, duty not to endanger oneself in agreements. Is Hobbes sovereign, truly totalitarian? Yes, because those rights don't matter for shit. You have perfect right of self-defense against a sovereign who has a complete monopoly on force and a complete monopoly on what doctrines can even be said or taught. It's totalitarian. The fact that there's a few mentions of rights that you can exercise that aren't going to do you any damn good doesn't mean that it's not. Hobbes isn't Locke. Govin says, what are my thoughts on dogmatic scientism and the general population and in academia? Like any sort of one-sided doctrine, it's it's a bad thing. It's keeping people from thinking things through adequately, making sure they miss large portions of the world and fundamentally don't understand themselves. And it often makes people into kind of, crusaders. And, there is a good bit of it in the general population. I think a lot of that is sort of convenience. As soon as people start to encounter a major existential life crisis, they might abandon that. Academia, you find some people like that as well. Boomer, opinion on the new atheists, or more specifically the Four Horsemen. I don't take them seriously, in part because I'm, a historian of ideas. So there's nothing new about their new atheism. It's the same old the same old stuff as we saw in the 19th century and even in the Enlightenment. It's just got a couple new twists to it. Instead of talking about this, we talk about this. They're not doing anything fundamentally new, and most of their arguments aren't particularly good. You could still be an atheist, and there could be good reasons for it, but you ain't going to get it from those guys, I think. Mark says, will I comment on the meaning of Plato's allegory of the cave? Is this people sticking to the beliefs they were exposed to growing up without knowledge of the world? Well, I mean, the actual context of it is the allegory of the cave is an allegory meant to be a story to illustrate another story, the story of the philosopher, i.e. Socrates, trying to awaken people to realities beyond just what they see, hear, think, and not being taken seriously, and then being killed as a result. That's one main meaning of it. That's the sort of the original meaning. But then you can make of it whatever you want. You can say, oh, it's the world of today where we're being fed lies by the media. it's funny too, the people who always talk about being fed lies by the media, it's never the media that they like. So like, it's always the mainstream media, but Fox News is completely truthful, or it's some other nonsense flip of that, rather than considering it all to be equally shaky. So you can do it with that. You can talk about the sensual world that we have. It's an allegory. You can twist it in a lot of different ways. You can even ask questions that go outside of the allegory, like, where do these people get their food? What's the deal with those people behind them? Are they in the know about this? Plato doesn't tell us, but we can engage in all sorts of imagination about that, can't we? So yeah. Noazia, would you consider yourself more of a psychoanalyst or schizoanalyst? I'm not one of either. So I'm not, when it comes to Deleuze, I've said this many times, I don't really like the stuff Deleuze does with Guattari that much. I like Deleuze by himself, so Anti-Oedipus is not, it's an interesting book. It's not something I think I really buy much into. I think that Deleuze is often much more insightful when he's doing his own thing. And I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'll use some psychoanalytic ideas, but it's not like I belong to a psychoanalytic school, or anything like that. I don't think that these are your only possible choices. So, all right. IDW Chungus, thoughts on Nick Land and accelerationism? Don't know. Haven't read Nick Land. People are always saying, we want you to read him. And that reminds me, actually, there was somebody on Twitter who said they'd send me a copy of the book if I give them my address. So I got to go in and take care of that. But I don't, I read stuff that people will send me or that I think is particularly important. I haven't read Fang Noumena, so can't really say much. All right. Xander, do I consider Machiavelli a philosopher? I've heard some philosophy departments push back against teaching or covering him. Yeah, he's a philosopher, clearly. He's doing political philosophy. That is a branch of philosophy. Don't ever take a particular group of philosophers saying that somebody's not a philosopher as a verdict, like for philosophy in general. There's many people who take Machiavelli quite seriously as a philosopher, and they read more than the Prince. They read the Discourses on Livy, and some of them even try to get stuff out of his comedy. There's huge gaps in most philosophy departments. People, won't teach, say, Alexis de Tocqueville, who they should teach. He's definitely a philosopher, but he's seen as, like a social theorist. So you go to your poli-sci department to do him, or American studies, right? And we can say similar things with so many other people who do deserve to be taught as philosophers. Ken Sarah, do I have a strong view on Hilary Putnam as a philosopher? I do not. I don't really care much about Hilary Putnam. Kind of a big deal when I was in graduate school. Actually came to Southern Illinois University. I didn't find his stuff interesting enough to really check it out. All right. Doglovich, Heidegger claims concealment and disclosure are two sides of the same coin. How would you view propaganda? Propaganda is putting forth a position, and there's going to be some things in it that it may, open up to you. Mostly they're going to be garbage and bullshit by virtue of being propaganda, but it certainly tells you about the mindset of the people who are engaging in it. And then there's all sorts of sides to it that you can open up and see what's really there, like some deep dark secrets that are being hashed out, or the various lies going on in there. Dear Manshian, thank you so much for your videos on Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Oh, you're very welcome. That's nice. Glad that they're helpful for you. Text that I've been meaning to get to for core concept videos, but I just haven't found the time. Sandy, do I think the current distribution of income can be justified? If there's no absolute poverty, can inequality be considered bad or wrong? No, the current distribution of income is very unjust, and not just the current distribution of income, but the current distribution of wealth and current distribution of risks. It's incredibly unjust. That's part of why COVID did such a number on the United States. We have been a screwed up nation basically, my whole lifetime, once you start actually looking at how things work, and it's been getting worse and worse. And, neither political party is really doing much about it. The Democrats at least do something once in a while. The Republicans try to make it, worse to their benefit as much as possible. And so, no, you can talk about things being more just or being more fair, but it's pretty bad right now. Chris Gatewood, does the unusual thought process involved in systems thinking bring challenges to more linear discourse? Have you always gravitated towards system thinking or systems philosophy? No, I don't. What they call systems theory, that's not what I do. I'm just talking about looking at things in a systematic way. And people have been doing that for generations without, having to go and buy books on systems theory or anything like that. I find that a lot of times when people are denigrating linear stuff, it's usually a caricature. Most linear stuff is actually a lot more dynamic. So, all right, Samata, will you ever do videos on Spinoza? Yeah, eventually down the line. As I always say, when people are asking questions about that, and then I post my, why don't you do videos about this? Anybody who wants to commission me to do videos on their favorite philosopher can, hire me and bankroll the production of that, because doing videos on this person means I got to stop my plans on this person over here. So, I'm game to do videos on anybody I'm competent to do things on. I don't teach Spinoza very often, although I have taught Spinoza in the past, in part because I don't find Spinoza as interesting as some of the other philosophers who I'm talking about. But that's a preference thing. Other people are really into Spinoza. If you're really, really super into Spinoza, you can feel free to get some people together and I'll, shoot some commissioned videos. All right. Let's see here. So Samir wants to ask two main questions, but like I said, everybody gets one question. Am I familiar with the works of medieval Islamic theologians, philosophers, polymaths like Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd? Yes, I am familiar with them. I don't read Arabic, so I'm leery about relying heavily on translations that I can't check stuff on. Same reason that I don't do an awful lot of stuff on Chinese philosophy, even though I do teach it. So yeah. David Doring, can you explain what you mean when you say you're a pluralist? How does that fit in with being a Christian? Pluralism means that you draw on different points of view, and you don't think that any of them are, absolutely, they've got the market cornered on truth. Depends on what kind of Christian you are. I mean, if you're like if you're an evangelical Bible thumper who thinks that everything is contained in the Bible, perspicuity of Scripture, it's not going to be compatible with that. But that is actually historically a very weird aberration of Christianity, not reflected in the vast tradition. You could say how does this pose a problem for me any more than it does for Lactantius or Justin Martyr or any of these early Christian thinkers? I don't see an issue there. Marina, is there any philosophical work that addresses eclecticism versus assimilation? Maybe not in those terms. I don't know. That'd be a great thing to Google, wouldn't it? Easy enough to find if it does exist. But I would say that, you could look at Cicero and read On the Ends and see what he's doing in that book. By book 5, it shows you his sort of attitude towards these things. William James, another great person to look at about pluralism itself. So yeah. Ben, best advice for teaching yourself propositional logic? I expect to put in a good bit of time doing propositional logic. I don't know. It's not something that I guess I kind of taught myself logic years and years and years ago because I went beyond what my class had. But I was an undergraduate then. That was almost 30 years ago. And the way that I do things usually is not particularly effective for others. Let's see. Ben asks, Would you say that Aquinas' synderesis principle is necessarily self-evident? I wouldn't call it a principle. I would say that synderesis is something that's within us, according to Aquinas, and that is it necessarily self-evident? You want to read Thomas and look at what he says about self-evidence, because there isn't any one single meaning to self-evident. Is it self-evident in the sense that like everybody immediately intuitively grasps it? No, obviously not. Is it self-evident in that, were you to arrive at a better viewpoint on things, looking at the world, looking at yourself, you're probably going to arrive at that? Sure. But is that what you call necessarily? Probably not. So, but I would actually go to the discussions on conscience, synderesis, the natural law. And I'd also look earlier in the Summa where he talks about things being self-evident, like where he treats is God's existence self-evident. Per se nota is the term in Latin. All right. Diogenes the Cynic, do you think it's worth delving deep into process philosophy? Do I consider it to be a valuable movement? I liked reading Whitehead and Process and Reality, but that is a tough book. So if you're going to do that, plan to give yourself a lot of time, right? Hartshorne, I encountered him mostly in relation to studying Anselm, because Hartshorne had like his own version of the ontological argument. And I haven't read too many other process philosophers. I mean, some people want to say Bergson is a process philosopher, and I guess you could say he is, but Bergson is really doing his own thing over here. I really like Bergson, so if you think, if you're asking about that, I think Bergson is well worth studying. But it depends on what you're interested in doing. It was a important movement in philosophy. It's kind of lost its steam, you could say. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth studying. I mean, look at how much interest there is in, take two examples, existentialism and Stoicism in the present, right? If you were to say 30 years ago that Stoicism was going to be a big thing that a lot of people would be taking seriously and studying, a lot of people would have laughed at you. So Lawrence Becker was kind of, and people like Anthony Long and Chris Gill were sort of voices in the wilderness, at that time. People who were interested in virtue ethics were mostly interested in Aristotelian virtue ethics. And you could say, like existentialism. By the time that I was an undergraduate and then in graduate school, people were like, existentialism is done, that's dead, we're moved on to other stuff. But now it's back, people are reading the existentialists again. So, I mean, there's something similar could happen with process philosophy, I would say. All right. Oops, just skipped a bit. Let's see where we were. It was Ricky. Here we go. Ricky says, I want to say thank you for helping me understand a political philosophy course I was in and to better understand the Republic and the Apology. Well, that's great. I'm glad that you enjoyed that. And that it was helpful for you. So Nathan says, I watched your video on Yoshihiro. What did he mean by making philosophy dialogical as opposed to monological? Is this similar to Buber's idea of ich du and ich es? I mean, it's similar to Bakhtin's ideas. That's why he had me reading Bakhtin. It's similar to, sure, it's similar to Buber's idea of ich du and ich es, meaning I, thou, I, it. But it's so similar to plenty of other stuff. And what did he mean by that? I mean, he meant that in a lot of cases, philosophy is sort of like you talk at somebody, you present somebody with something, and then there's no real back and forth. I don't think he's actually right about that, about modern philosophy. There are dialogues in modern philosophy. There are important exchanges that take place. Some of modern philosophy, even if it seems to be monological, maybe dialogical, I actually think the meditations are myself, but that's a minority view. So Yoshihiro was an interesting guy. He was really quite introverted. He could speak good English, but didn't trust his English. And Once he got interested in something, like he'd read everything about it. And I can't say that he was actually a friend as such, but because there wasn't that intimacy that you need for friendship. But he was something more than just a acquaintance as well. So I don't know what happened to him down the road. I don't think we've been in touch for at least 10 years. Mostly peaceful fascist. Are there any politicians that are not accused of having a cult? Seems a natural state of a leader to have ideological followers. Yeah, that's a silly thing to say. If you really think that simply having followers and being ideological means having a cult, you're using cult in a very different sense than when I was talking about the recent Supreme Court justice issue, right? She actually belongs to a cult. You can just check it out and find that to be the case. So, and are there politicians whose followers are not simply ideologues? Yeah, there's plenty of them. I mean, there are people who operate in good faith in politics, and then there's people who are in bad faith in politics, and we need to be able to distinguish between these and between nut job ideologues, or we're never going to get out of the situation that we're in at present. So, yeah, I really ignore this sort of leveling across the board kind of stuff as being non-starters. All right. Looks like we have people who want to argue that case. Marina, she argued against the death penalty. Religion has more leverage in this than any other pursuit. I don't care if she argued against the death penalty. That's one thing. And so, you can find all sorts of other things where she's going to be a terrible justice. But, you think whatever you like. R.T. Whitby, do you think Plato recognized the genius of Aristotle when he was a student? Good question. I don't know. I mean, if he did, why didn't he designate Aristotle his successor? Maybe he did recognize it, but he also recognized this guy can't fit in here. It's tough to say. We don't have enough reliable history stuff to tell us what was the case there. What we do know is that Aristotle was an out-of-towner. Plato essentially made his nephew. Carried out some nepotism, literally nepotism. Nepos means nephew, right? So Plato made his nephew Speusippus the next scholarch of the academy. So yeah. All right. Let me skip down. Here we go. Epistemic mind. Is it me or is the lay public's perception of the discipline of philosophy heavily influenced by the continental school? It frustrates me. People see philosophy as akin to poetry or literature. It is you. The lay public's perception of the discipline of philosophy is so vague as to not be associated with analytic or continental or history of philosophy schools. Where it would be different is where they've had some connection, some exposure to that, but most lay people's conceptions of philosophy are overly vague. I mean, my own family, who are, my extended family, the Lemrees family, who are, largely blue collar, it took them 10 years to actually realize that I was not a psychologist. When I was studying philosophy, I had to have those conversations with them over and over and over again at family reunions until finally some of their kids were in college and were taking philosophy classes, and then they realized that these are different disciplines. So yeah. All right. Devani asks if I'm familiar with the work of Bernhard Stiegler. No, I've never read Stiegler. I guess he died recently. I'm not familiar. Probably 99% of the people who one could ask about who are contemporary philosophers, I probably don't know their work, because there are literally tens of thousands of philosophers currently writing books and all of that. So usually I won't know who they are. Some people have recommended Stiegler, but kind of busy, with the work that I'm currently doing. John Ortiz, how important is it to know mathematics? Well, if you want to balance your checkbook, kind of important. Personal finance is one important aspect of that. I mean, I don't know that you need to know like linear algebra to worry about whether shipped is going to get your groceries to you on time or anything like that. I mean, mathematics is worth studying, and there is a certain kind of disciplining that happens with studying mathematics that's important. I'm going to tell you a funny story too. Little digression. I had a parent-teacher conference yesterday, and my youngest kid is a bit, very, very bright, in the same way that I think that I was bright and feeling bored, not challenged enough sometimes with the classes that they're in. And anyway, now I've never heard, like when I was a kid, we would sometimes have, here's a great example. So I've got this, this is my textbook for the world religions class that I'm currently teaching. So I'd have a textbook, right? And then I put a comic book inside and read what I wanted to read, or another book or something like that. And I would screw off in class like that. So my youngest daughter is doing math in math class, but it's not the math that she was assigned to do in math class, in part because she's bored with the math that she's supposed to do in math class. So, that's quite interesting. I never heard of anybody smuggling in other math to work on. So I saw my older daughter last night, and I told her about this, and she said, "Ooh, yeah, I gave her that algebra book because she wanted to study algebra, and I had some of my old books from high school laying around, so I gave her that one." And I was like, "Oh, that's how she did it." So some people really enjoy math so much that they'll go on to study it on their own, against the rules, in a math class where they're supposed to be working on other math. So quite a story there. How important is it to know mathematics? I'd say it's pretty important, Another thing I'll say too is people sometimes say, "Oh, I'm just not good at math." Well, you're not good at math in the same way that you're not good at playing guitar. If you want to learn to play guitar, practice playing guitar, right? And learn some scales and do the work. If you want to get good at math, put in the work. It's not as if we just have native talent or something like that. A lot of people allowed teachers to tell them that, and they also tell themselves that when, it's just like learning a foreign language. If you want to learn a foreign language, study the foreign language, You want to learn how to dance, go to dance class. All right, Emron says, "Can you kindly say something about Deleuze's philosophy? How can it be useful? I wonder what use is his philosophy." Well, it's useful to enjoy studying difficult texts. Right? I'll tell you one example that I've brought up many times to clients. Deleuze has a set of essays called Essays Critical and Clinical, and in it he's got a discussion of the Billy Budd story by Herman Melville. And in it, Deleuze does his typical shtick. He's like, he's going to draw some other ideas out of this. And one of the things that he lays out is about the law, because Billy Budd is going to be, punished, even though he doesn't deserve to be punished. And Deleuze notes that the law or moral norms can hold back a lot of the wrongdoing that people do, but the law has to be somewhat brutal in order to do that. And it doesn't actually prevent the really bad people. They will still keep on doing what they're doing. They go through it like, going through a spider web. But it will hold back a lot of the middle range jerks, bad people, but it's also going to, in its dragnet, catch up innocent people and do bad things to them as well. And so this is a great insight. He's using a story to communicate that. We can talk about how policing works, and the fact that many innocent people are often caught up in dragnets based on race or class or just geographical area, and so that's a valuable insight. And there's lots of valuable insights like that in Deleuze. So it depends on what you want to use them for. Paul Laughlin, what did I argue in my doctoral thesis? Oh, a bunch of different things. It was kind of a mess, That's why I never turned it into a book. It really needed to be split into 3 different things, each of which would be a book. One was that, Maurice Blondel was providing an understanding of the relationship between Christianity and philosophy that was needed today, and that could address contemporary issues and demands. I don't, I haven't looked at it for over 10 years, quite frankly. I mean, I defended it in 2002. So I'd have to actually go back to it and look at some of those things. I was also really fascinated by using the untranslated stuff because I could translate it easily. So, I was incorporating stuff from his trilogy and other things, but I quickly moved on to other Blondel related things. Adian, I'm doing a Nietzsche course at the University of Aberdeen. I really appreciate your content. I'm glad that it's helpful for you. Govind asked, would I be interested in joining Discord? There's a Discord server called the Philosophy Chat where we have weekly readings of the work of Hegel, Kant, analytic tradition, German idealism. I went on Discord, by invitation a couple of years ago, and at least the server that I was on just seemed like a mishmash of people just like talking past each other, and it didn't seem like a good use of my time. I have to admit I don't really understand Discord or what I would be doing with it or what I would be using it for. Somebody would have to like walk me through it and make a case for why, given all the other things that I do, why it would be a good use of my time rather than spending that time shooting videos, doing podcast stuff, meeting with clients who pay me, teaching classes, offering the other kinds of online events like this that I'm doing right now. So I don't know. I don't know enough about Discord to say, right? All right. Marcia, what do I dislike about the Stoics? I think that, some of the cultural assumptions that they make probably need to be left behind. I think that despite talking about the social nature of human beings, that there's a bit too much focus on the individual, and there needs to be more on relationships and how we foster each other. But this is the sort of stuff that, like, contemporary Stoics, just like Neo-Aristotelians, can rebuild into it. I mean, traditions are living through finding these pain points and then improving on them. So let's see. Jason says, what do I think William James has to offer both philosophy and psychology today? Do I think religious experience is due for a comeback in our society or just a relic of the past? Religious experience never went away. So I don't know why it would have a comeback. People have been reporting religious experiences continually. And what do I think William James has to offer both philosophy and psychology? I mean, the pragmatic method discussion stuff is pretty important. The will to believe. That's why I teach that in my intro to philosophy classes is a great essay as well. And his discussions of the emotions, I think, has some useful things to provide us. I don't fully agree with the way he structures stuff, but I think there's some valuable insights there. I mean, when it comes to psychologists, I'd have to have psychologists weigh in on that probably. But I really enjoyed James. Then again, I've been reading him for quite a long time. By the way, James had a connection with Maurice Blondel. James viewed Blondel as a pragmatist, and Blondel was cool with that until he found out what James meant by pragmatist. And then he was like, yeah, don't call me a pragmatist. I'm all about action. I'm all about, figuring out how things develop outside of the world of pure thought in practical activity, but I'm not a pragmatist like you. And one of the things that's kind of cool is Blondel's Axiom in 1893 sold out very quickly. And James wanted to read the book. So James wrote him and said, hey, do you have any extra copies? Blondel sent James his last remaining copy and said, hey, don't lose this. I'm going to need it back. That was how generous this guy was. And James, read it and, thought it was quite interesting, then sent it back, then found out that he had the author's only original copy. So that's kind of cool. All right. Let's see. Gil, gosh, I know you're mostly a scholar of Western philosophy. Who do you like to read as far as Eastern philosophy is concerned? I mean, when I have the time, which is not always, I like teaching world religions because it always gives me a chance to go back and like read, various Buddhist works and the Tao Te Ching again, and other Taoist literature like the Zhuangzi. Um, I'll teach actually sometimes in intro to philosophy class the Mencius and sometimes the Analects. And I find this stuff interesting to check out and to read through. But like I said, I'm kind of handicapped. I don't have the facility with the languages, and that for me kind of sucks because I know how important it is to be able to read things in the original if I want to go back to things. So yeah, it's sort of a wide smattering. I mean, my interests are very diverse. I like teaching stuff in religious studies because it lets me look at like entire worldviews of civilizations and do a lot of comparative work. So, all right. Mark asks, how would Hegel interpret this point in history with COVID versus Neopian in reference to freedom? I'm not sure what Neopian is. I mean, Hegel would look at, as the world is, America's failed response to COVID, which it's really happening for four main reasons. One is things were shitty before COVID. Our healthcare system is not a system. It's been a mess for years and years and years, many inequalities and all sorts of inefficiencies in it. We're the only developed nation that doesn't have state-provided healthcare, as we should. And it's because of the second thing, which is a highly ideological conception of freedom that stresses personal liberties and whatever the Republican Party has picked up lately and run with as what real freedom is. And from a Hegelian perspective, that is just foolish nonsense. And really from most other perspectives of freedom. Got into an interesting thing, with one of my conservative friends and colleagues, where he was like, what freedoms have we lost under COVID? And he's thinking like freedom to travel. He doesn't want to wear a mask, stuff like that. And I was like, the freedom not to friggin' die from some jerk offs who think that they ought to like walk around, do whatever the hell they want and infect people. I mean, the freedom to actually live, kind of a big freedom. I'm sort of like a Rooseveltian four freedoms guy. Freedom from fear is an important freedom, right? And these like personal liberty people, they think that their freedom is like the one that matters most, and they ignore everything else. So that's a second major issue. The third is that we don't have a system. We don't actually have a healthcare system. We have all these different states, each of which have their own exchanges. There's people who don't fit into them. We have Medicaid, we have Medicare. We have all these private insurance companies that are primarily just interested in making money. They don't care about human lives very much or quality of life. And this has been allowed to be the case. And again, both parties bear blame for that, right? Particularly centrist Democrats, but the Republicans have been much worse on that in the last 20 years from what I've seen. And then the last thing was a total failure of leadership on the federal level and on many state levels, where, like, for example, here in Wisconsin, our do-nothing Republicans have because of gerrymandering, they have more power than they should, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court has more conservatives than it should. And our governor's reasonable mask mandate was struck down. People playing politics with people's lives, right? So Hegel would look at that and he'd be like, wow, this is irrationality on irrationality on irrationality. This is a failed culture, a failed state. And that's the way a lot of people worldwide are looking at us. And rightly so. This may be, for everybody who's like, oh, America has to stay number one and all that. You want America to stay number one? Enact universal health care. That would be like a major thing that you could do. Get over your qualms, whatever ideological bugaboos you've got, that are whispering in your ear, this isn't freedom. And just enact it like reasonable people. And then you have a shot at like holding on to our current position, if that's really what matters to you. Otherwise, forget it. It ain't going to happen, just hear my cat crying. Where is she? Sassy cat is almost 18 years old, and I'm not quite sure where she is or what she's crying for. Hopefully she's not stuck somewhere. Like she's found herself occasionally being stuck on the table. Let me just go check on her super quick. Oh, there you are. Okay. Yep, that was her. Here she is, my little 18-year-old. Well, almost 18. She'll be 18 in November. I think she's getting a little bit senile because she's getting on a table and not being sure quite how to get down from it and yowling like you heard her doing. So she is the last of our four-legged family. We're getting, by the way, a carrier so I can like take her on walks with her cuddled up sort of like this with me. All right, let me get back to questions. Let's see here. T. Maggio, what are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson and people unfamiliar with philosophy as a whole, like Stephen Hicks and Sam Harris talking about the field so poorly? Well, I mean, Stephen Hicks is actually a philosopher. I know the guy. He's brought me down to Rockford University, although not lately. You may have heard me saying bad stuff about his book. And, so he's a Randian, pretty hardcore Randian, and important in those circles. His book on postmodernism is just garbage, and Peterson relied on it. And so, that's why you actually got to know the texts that you're studying. I mean, Peterson, to talk about that thing, so he goes to talk about communism and then admits he hasn't actually read anything other than the Communist Manifesto. That's pretty pitiful, pretty pathetic. If you've ever read his Maps of the Mind, not a great book. I haven't read his 12 Rules, but there's an awful lot of people who really glom onto these types, and they're like, oh, have you read this person? Have you read this person? Oh, it's so awesome. And you're like, I don't know, I'm going to spend the time on reading that. And then when you do, you're like, oh, this is, I mean, what's good in this is already over in these people, and the rest of it's all garbage. So not a big fan of Peterson. I don't have to be, I guess. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting comment from MCC. I grew up in Colorado in the 80s and 70s. It's the same thing with respect to skiing. No middle class or poor native Coloradans skied then, too expensive. Yeah. I mean, you can still ski in Colorado because global warming hasn't meant that you don't get enough snow the way that is the case here, unfortunately, in Wisconsin. But yeah, there's a lot of class distinctions like that. All right. Let's see. Who haven't I taken a question from? We're getting close to time too. Max Lawton, here's a good question. At what point do you think clarity of style becomes an unnecessary impediment to understanding philosophy? Did Heidegger and Hegel have to write the way they did in order to communicate their ideas? I would say you could say that Heidegger and Hegel could be more clear, but yeah, you can't. There's a way of making things clear that actually makes them less clear because you're no longer talking about the same thing. This is a big problem in analytic philosophy, where, and also in among a lot of historians of among a lot of historians of philosophy, where they oversimplify and they get things wrong. It's sort of like with Occam's razor. Occam's razor is not, the simpler explanation is the best explanation. It is entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. Are those exactly the same thing? No. And in order to understand, what do you mean entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity? Well, you got to, think things through a bit, right? But it becomes more clear when you think, okay, so if there's like 16 principles that I need in order to make sense out of this phenomenon, I shouldn't, deal with 26 instead. But you also shouldn't deal with 8. And so you can say something similar, kind of analogously, on lexical lines. You're probably not going to be able to teach Hegel sufficiently by trying to make it simpler than it is. Maybe I've done that. I don't know. Maybe my videos have oversimplified Hegel as well. Let's see here. Daniel asks, I'm interested in comparing Aristotle's virtue ethics with Eastern philosophy. What do I think about their social conventions? Whose social conventions? Eastern philosophy? I mean, there is no such thing as Eastern philosophy to begin with. There is Chinese philosophy, which is its own vast cultural sphere with multiple massive traditions that change over time. And then influences like Japanese philosophy and Korean philosophy. So we can talk about the entire, East Asian cultural sphere. Then there's the Indian subcontinent with its own whole thing, right? And then we've got, various indigenous philosophies, which often are, considerable sophistication. And then we've got the whole field of Islamic thought. So there is no such thing as Eastern philosophy. I would say look for things that if you want to do comparative work, look for things that are kind of similar to what it is that you want to talk about. So like when it comes to virtue ethics, the thing that people usually do is Aristotle and Confucius, right? Or Aristotle and some stuff from the Arthashastra, but you gotta kind of dig in and find where you think the similarities are going to be, and then I guess you can do something with it. Let's see what else we got. Zeno asks, what are our thoughts on the existentialist? Would you consider Nietzsche an existentialist or something different? So, I mean, I've got a couple of videos specifically on this. I think existentialism is a broad tent that a lot of figures fit into, and there's no one single definition of it. And people who try to give one single definition of it are either like Sartre, trying to bogart the whole field to themselves, or they're oversimplifying, or they just don't know what they're doing. And often take their lead from Sartre then. Hey, existentialism is the philosophy that means that existence precedes essence. Well, that's not everybody. And Nietzsche is solidly within the existentialist sphere. Lev Shestov, who I've been releasing videos on, is one of the people who clearly identified, he was the second generation existentialist. He clearly identified the connections between Nietzsche and these other existentialist thinkers. And so, there is no one single definition, but there are key themes that you can point at. And again, I've done a couple videos on that, so you might want to take a look at those. Let me scroll down. We're getting close to the end of our time. Let me see if there's anything particularly compelling. Here's a good one from Chris Beltran. Have I ever participated in philosophy-based debates? I'm a big fan of the old Intelligence Squared Oxford-style debates. Would love to hear you participate in something like that. I don't think that debates are usually that useful. You got to have somebody who's worth debating with, and you got to have some pretty clear lines about what you're going to do. I prefer dialogues and discussions. I don't like discussing things with people who aren't in good faith. It's not usually worth my time. That said, if somebody wants me to do debates, they can pay me to do that, since that'd be taking time away from my other endeavors and doing something that I normally wouldn't do. I don't think that you're going to see, Intelligence Squared calling me up, because I'm not a big name in philosophy, right? And I'm not like teaching at important schools where most of their chums come from. So that probably won't be an issue. All right, let's see if we can take one more thing. I was reading something about, do I have a good chair for reading? I mean, I read in a bunch of different chairs. Okay. So here's a good one to go out on from Sunny. I've been trying to learn more about philosophy for a while, and it's one of my biggest interests. Why do I feel like I don't truly understand or learn? So that is a common experience. I go through that myself every once in a while, where I'm like, man, I just I'm not getting it, you know? And I'll tell you, there are times when I get in front of that chalkboard and I've filled it up with stuff like for the half-hour Hegel videos. This is sometimes the issue. And I've like read and reread the passages I'm going to talk about, you know, a couple times. And, you know, I've been reading Hegel now for, I don't know, 25 years in a serious way. And sometimes I'll get up there and I'm ready to shoot and I'm like, man, I can't remember what the hell I was going to talk about. I look at the board and I'm like, this kind of makes sense. And then I'm like, well, I'm not shooting today. That happens. That's okay. That's you know, you can't be like on all the time. And, you know, if you feel like you're not grasping the totality of a philosopher's work, that's okay. You don't necessarily have to in order for what you're grasping to be valuable. If you are reading, say, Seneca, for example, right? Seneca wrote a lot. Let's say you read through one of his biggest works, the Moral Letters or Letters to Lucilius, and you get some stuff out of it, and other things are confusing to you, and you kind of see how things hold together, but not completely, and you can't like answer questions like, well, what would Seneca say about this? You still have accomplished what you've accomplished. You still do know something. It's not like a complete void. And the other thing I'll say too is don't measure yourself against sort of the best performances that other people are doing. When you see somebody doing a talk, or, you know, when you see one of my lecture videos, I have been prepping for that for a while, right? And if I don't like the take that I do, I will get rid of that. I've edited it, right? I often begin videos with, and every once in a while, one of them gets in there where I'm like, I start out and I'm like, today, you know, we're going to talk about Unamuno's tragic sense of life and, you know, what he thought about philosophy. And I'll get to the point where I'm like, no, that's not right. I cut that off. And you're not seeing that. And when you're reading other people's books, you know, like Cicero's Academia or, you know, On the Nature of the Gods, you're getting the finished product. Don't measure your own thinking and work against that finished product. Even with anti-systematic thinkers like Nietzsche or Shestov, you are still getting a finished product that was edited. So, you know, you may still, well, you'll always, even if you're like the most accomplished thinker, you're still going to have more stuff to learn. But don't be so hard on yourself. Don't downgrade the things that you do know about the texts, thinkers, topics that you've been studying. So, all right, it's 1:33. I got to get something to eat and check on the sassy cat and get ready for my Patreon exclusive philosophy chat that I'll be doing. So thanks for all the questions. Got a lot of cool stuff coming up this month. If you haven't seen the update video, you probably want to check it out. A lot of online events coming up this month because of, you know, Stoicon, Stoicon X, Stoic Week, all of that. Have my Worlds of Speculative Fiction, of course, and the classic heavy metal class and all those other things. So you may want to check those things out. Hope that wherever you are in the world, you're having a good morning, evening, afternoon here. Might be middle of the night for those of you who are like in Australia or Japan. So I'll see all of you next time around.